Midtown Manhattan. My name is Peter Thompson. I serve as the vicar here, and whether you're joining us live in person on Park Avenue or online at stbarts.org, it is my joy and delight to welcome you here for the forum where each week we have sacred conversations about the things that matter. Today we're honored to have with us Professor Christopher Evans from Boston University, who will be talking about the social gospel, the heart of progressive Christianity, and his book, The Social Gospel in American Religion, is available in our bookstore, so I hope you'll pick up a copy after today's forum. To more fully introduce our guest, I am going to introduce someone many of you already know, our seminarian for this year, Nathan Peace, and this gives me an opportunity to thank Nathan for a year of service. He is finishing his academic year with us, and to announce that he'll be with us for a second academic year, which is exciting news. Nathan is a former student of Professor Evans, who is a mentor to him, and it will be a delight to see them in conversation today. Nathan, take it away.
Yes, thank you. And I am just so particularly excited to welcome the Reverend Dr. Christopher Evans here to St. Bart's, a wonderful professor from Boston University in the history of American Christianity and Methodist studies. He's here with his wife, the Reverend Robin Olson. They are both elders in the United Methodist Church, and we do congratulate them on a very successful General Conference that yielded many wonderful, wonderful things for the kingdom of God. And so, Dr. Evans, I hand it over to you for the social gospel.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Nathan. Just to say a very brief word about myself, as has been mentioned, I'm an ordained elder, Ministry of Word and Sacrament in the United Methodist Church. Most of my ministry has been in higher education. I've been involved in theological education now for a little bit over 30 years, and one of my greatest joys as a teacher has been just seeing students, like former students now, like Nathan, thrive in their ministry. And that's something that still gives me the greatest joy as a teacher. I also should mention, in addition to serving in a variety of Methodist churches, I also worked, I was on staff of an Episcopal church outside of Rochester, New York, Christ Church Church in Pittsburgh. And I have to share that to kind of put out my Episcopalian cred for all of you. But wonderful experiences in ministry that have informed my teaching. Well, the social gospel, what is it? The easiest definition to use, I think, is, and this is in relationship to the United Methodist Church's decision to lift prohibitions against LGBTQ plus persons in relationship particularly to allowing them to enter the ordained ministry. Part of how I would understand the legacy of the social gospel is how does Christianity make the door wider in terms of allowing a variety of different persons to have access to the blessings, to the graces, to the possibilities of holistic ministry in the broader Church of God. More specifically, and I do have to apologize because during the next 30 minutes or so, I will be doing some shameless self-promotion of some of my work. So please forgive me for that. But in my book, a fairly recent book, The Social Gospel in American Religion, I talk about how the social gospel in a very broad sense can be understood as a movement of Christianity that defined its mission through working towards a better society. It was a movement that was largely rooted in progressive, predominantly liberal theological worldview. And I think, again, particularly when you look at the social gospel in a historical arc, what separates it from more conservative forms of Christianity is the working towards a more pluralistic society. This is something that you see in a number of personalities that I'm going to be talking about today. And part of my presentation does have quite a bit of a New York City angle, because as the major urban area of the United States and in a city where Christianity continues to flourish, the roots of the social gospel are very deep here. When you look at the social gospel as a movement, as a very broad movement in Christianity, it has a lot of connections and parallels in developments in American Catholicism, as well as in American Judaism. Some New Yorkers might be familiar with the name Father Edward McGlynn, who was a labor priest in New York in the late 19th century. He was very involved in a number of ministries that were geared in terms of outreach to the poor. He was actually censored by the Catholic diocese, but became a very strong influence on a number of Catholic and Protestant reformers who came into the social gospel tradition in the late 19th and early 20th century. Other New Yorkers might be familiar with the name of Rabbi Stephen Wise, who was an active religious leader in the city of New York in the first half of the 20th century, was the founder of the Free Synagogue in New York. Now I believe it's called the Stephen Wise Free Synagogue. Very, very important figure. If I were to summarize the social gospel as a historical movement, it came into being largely through the circumstances of industrialization, the kind of changes that were taking place in the United States with immigration, with the wealth inequalities that were being exacerbated by industrial capitalism. And this is a theme that I'll get to in more detail in just a moment when I focus on a little detail of New York. I do want to make this PowerPoint available to folks who are interested, because it does have a list at the end of further reading and also a few useful links. This is an article, a link to an article that I wrote several years ago for a journal, online journal called The Conversation, that spells out a little bit more some of the definitions of the social gospel, some of the major figures that made up the movement. And part of my argument about the social gospel is that when you look at this tradition from the perspective of today, this is a large part of the historical DNA of what we would call religious progressivism. We talk a lot today, obviously, there's a lot of focus on the religious right, the conversations that I believe you probably have had in this forum related to Christian nationalism. And what I'd like to say about the history of the social gospel, it feeds into a history today of progressive activism that I think represents an important counter to the kind of message of the religious right. And I know St. Bart's is an example of one of many parishes in the city that I think follows within this trajectory. I talk about the fact that the social gospel emphasized, the term evangelical is a very much of a buzzword today, but in the context of 100 years ago or so, it tended to be a much broader term that talked about both the fidelity to scripture and tradition and experience. The idea, again, that being a Christian was focused in some way on the importance of a deep personal faith, or as the Methodist folks would say, a deep piety. But that goes hand in hand with the idea that the social gospel was geared towards the question of how does one transform social structures? Is the goal of Christianity primarily solely about personal conversion, or is there something more to it that leads to the hopefulness of creating a society that is free of the social sins, of inequality, of racism, sexism, economic justice, and so on. When I say contextual here, and this is where the history of New York, I think, comes into play in a major way, longtime New Yorkers might have some familiarity with Jacob Riis, who was in the late 19th century. He was a Danish immigrant to the US. He became a New York City reporter, and in 1890 he published a book called How the Other Half Lives. Now, this is a time of the so-called Gilded Age in the United States. The kind of American equivalent, if you will, of Downton Abbey, that kind of worldview of opulent wealth that oftentimes gets glamorized. And what Rees wanted to show through photographs of tenements in New York was the fact that there is another side to New York life and urban life that we simply don't see. In the midst of the Rockefellers and the Vanderbilts and all of the kind of big money figures within the context of American industrialization, you have this side of it. And keep in mind what it must have been like 130 years ago for people to open their newspapers and then open a book to see pictures like this. It really showed a kind of visceral aspect of the impact of poverty. And this was a reality that I think galvanized a number of ministers and lay people in urban areas throughout the United States to take action. In a lot of respects, the roots of the social gospel are very strong within the history of the Anglican and in the Episcopal churches. And I think one reason for that is, historically, when you look at the Church of England, when you look at the situation in Great Britain, in the United States, very similar histories of industrialization in the late 19th century. And part of that reality is that most of the major Protestant churches in the majority of cities tended to be Episcopalian or Anglican. It's not that other denominations weren't there, but I think in a lot of ways in the US, the Episcopal Church was well positioned to come face to face with the kind of conditions of urban poverty that were critical to the emergence of the social gospel. This gentleman here is a very famous 19th century Anglican theologian, Frederick Denison Maurice. Still worth reading in many respects, but he identified very strongly with the term Christian socialism. Now, the word socialism is very much a buzzword in the United States today. It tends to carry a lot of negative connotations. But Maurice saw it as a way to reflect how the ethics of Jesus, particularly when you look at the tradition of the Gospels, emphasizes a message of loving your neighbor, of making sure that you are engaged in ministries and outreach that reach out to the stranger, that seek to alleviate in some way the poverty that the least of those that Jesus talked about experienced. And he was very instrumental in establishing what we would probably call today settlement houses, intentional communities of oftentimes not just men, but of women who were involved in urban outreach ministries and seeking to alleviate the suffering of the poor. One of my favorite individuals in this tradition is an Episcopal priest named William Dwight Porter Bliss. Now, Bliss started off, he was a congregational minister, and then he saw the light. He joined the Episcopal Church, became an ordained clergy person, and he was a very, very much ahead of his time. Later in the 20th century and into the 21st century, you would see an example of a lot of what people would call maybe worker churches, or churches that were set up that were designed to be intentional about reaching out to the communities, oftentimes reflected in people who were quite poor. And Bliss founded a church in Boston in the 1880s called the Church of the Carpenter. And it was a church that didn't last very long. and Bliss himself said he was very good on the programmatic side, but he kind of neglected the finances a little bit. But as I said, if you look at cities like New York, you see examples of these kind of worker churches blossoming. And I think that they still remain in various forms today. Some of you, again, longtime New Yorkers, might have heard of a Presbyterian named Charles Stetzel, who operated a very similar and much larger experiment like this in New York in the early 20th century. Now, one of Bliss's parishioners was a woman by the name of Vida Dutton Scutter, who was an Episcopalian and probably the most prominent theologian of her era that few people have heard of. She too had a very interesting pilgrimage. She started out, she was the daughter of congregational missionaries in India. Her parents died, well, her father died when she was very young, and she came back to Boston, ended up going to Trinity Church, where Phillips Brooks, a very famous American preacher, was responsible for bringing her into the Episcopal fold. Scudder taught for many decades as a professor of English literature at Wellesley College. She was very influenced. She had spent time studying at Oxford, and she studied with a very famous philosopher by the name of John Ruskin, who was responsible for what was commonly called the arts and crafts movement of the late 19th century. The idea, again, of sort of renouncing industrialization and encouraging craftsmanship, the idea of building your own furniture, growing your own food, and so on. But Ruskin had a lot of influence on a number of intellectuals, both in and outside the Anglican Church. And what you see with Vida Dutton Scudder is she worked, her day job was at Wellesley, but she spent a lot of time as a labor organizer. She was involved with the Socialist Party in the United States, almost lost her job at Wellesley because of that. But if you read some of her writings, what I think is very interesting about her is that she was interested in bringing together kind of what we would call a Catholic sensitivity. You know, the idea that worship, devotional life, prayer, routines of prayer and contemplation were just as important as social action, and they were in some way very inseparable for her. And she was indicative, I think, of the fact that a lot of the major figures in the social gospel who were kind of on the front line, so to speak, of the social problems of the 19th century were women. Now, here is another, again, shameless self-promotion, and I don't know if the bookstore has this particular book here, but it is fairly easy to pick up on Amazon, if not. A woman by the name of Frances Willard. And Willard was, beyond being a good Methodist, was probably the most well-known women's rights activist of the late 19th century. She was a leader in women's higher education. She was the first woman dean at Northwestern University in Evanston. She was an activist church leader. She was president of an organization called the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Now, every time I try to talk about the prohibition or temperance movement with my students, they kind of look at me like I'm crazy. Didn't the 18th Amendment fail? Wasn't prohibition a bad idea? Well, yes and yes. In all likelihood, it was. But I think the other side of this is that when you look at a number of social reformers of the late 19th and early 20th century, including many within the Episcopal Church, their concern was not primarily focused on the morality of drinking, although that comes up. The purpose was to curtail the economic interest, the companies, the liquor producers, that were oftentimes supplying alcohol to saloons, There was no kind of regulation of alcohol consumption. And individuals like Willard were concerned about the fact that people who drank were oftentimes taking economic resources away from families. So there's a very, very interesting progressivism that surrounds the temperance movement. And if you want to learn more about it, then buy my book. Her motto was do everything. And what she meant by that, at a time period where women had few legal rights in the United States, she encouraged women to become politically active. She was very much a supporter of what she called what we've talked about already as Christian socialism. She was very close with Reverend Bliss, and the two of them were co-editors of a Christian socialist journal called The Dawn, which had a very short-lived circulation, but again was kind of a clearinghouse for a lot of the progressive leaders that we would associate with the progressive era in American history, as well as those coming out of the social gospel. But I think part of the aspect of do everything was at a time where women were restricted legally in terms of their rights, including, most importantly, the right to vote. Willard provided institutional space for women to get involved. And this parallels a lot of the broader history, I think, within American Protestantism, that churches basically, the finances within churches, the missions of churches owe a primary debt to the role of women in terms of opening up opportunities. As a matter of fact, one of the things that Frances Willard argued, and she was very much in support of women's ordination at a time where practically no Protestant churches were allowing that. But she used this argument. She said, well, look, women are 2/3 of the people that are involved in churches. They are oftentimes the ones that are raising money that support different aspects of what was called home or domestic missions back then, as well as foreign missions. They were also doing most of the work in churches. If you look across the spectrum of denominations, by 1900 or so, women were very much involved in doing a variety of organizations on a local and on a denominational level. And her translation was, well, we're doing the work and we're helping to raise the money, then why can't we be ordained? If we are the majority in the churches, we have a right to lead the churches. And she ended up in 1888 writing a fascinating little book called Women in the Pulpit. And if you read that today, you see a lot of connections to what you would call liberation theology. There's a tremendous link to Willard and what we would later call liberation theology. They're just very much ahead of her time, and a fascinating figure. I always like to mention one of my favorite books about Willard, what she actually wrote. In 1893, at a time when bicycle riding, when two-wheeled bicycle riding was taking off, she was incensed by the fact that male physicians of the time were writing articles and publishing books saying that women shouldn't exercise. It would kill their health, and it would damage them physically so they couldn't have children. So Willard, at the age of 53, learned to ride a bicycle, and she wrote a delightful little book. You can actually find it very easily online, called How I Learned to Ride a Bicycle. And the bicycle, which she named Gladys, became very much part of her trademark. And Willard was very good at generating publicity. And whenever she traveled by train, she would take her bicycle with her, and it became quite a sight in many urban areas of the United States to see Frances Willard pedaling by. But Willard represents, I think, a good example of somebody like the other figures I mentioned who was interested in opening doors up, expanding the parameters of who counted within Christianity. People like Dwight William Porter Bliss in terms of economic justice, Vida Scutter, Francis Willard, and others for promoting the expansion of women's rights in the church. Now, the final figure I want to talk about, and this is probably a name that a few of you have heard of in New York. Probably the most prominent minister of the pulpit in New York City was Harry Emerson Fosdick. I know several months ago, I believe there was a forum here on Leighton Parks and what was called the Fundamentalist Modernist controversy, and how Dr. Parks preached a very contentious sermon related to the virgin birth that got him into a lot of trouble. But Parks and Fosdick were kindred spirits in the sense that they favored a theological vision that was more open and more inclusive, moving away from a very rigid doctrinal understanding of Christianity. I think a wonderful book to learn about Fosdick is his autobiography, which is either called The Autobiography of Harry Emerson Fosdick. Sometimes it also has the title of a very famous hymn that Fosdick wrote called God of Grace and God of Glory. And the title of this book oftentimes appears as the living of these days from that hymn. But Fosdick, in addition to being a professor of homiletics at Union Seminary, Fosdick was probably the most well-known preacher in New York City and probably in the United States in terms of the liberal pulpit. He was a national figure on the radio. He had a number of roots in the tradition of the social gospel, coming out of his background and also coming out of the experiences in the First World War, where he worked as a chaplain on the front lines of Western Europe, and the experience there of seeing war up close, in some ways really radicalized Fosdick. He had an education at Colgate University in Union. He was very influenced by a theologian named Walter Rauschenbusch, who I'll say more about in just a minute. Probably the preeminent theologian of the social gospel. But Fosdick, particularly after World War I, served in quite a few capacities as a visiting preacher. He had a long-time appointment as the preaching minister at First Presbyterian Church in New York, and ultimately left that church and became the founding minister of Riverside Church in New York, which in some ways still has the kind of reputation of being sort of at the center of a lot of social gospel impulses. Fosdick was a wonderful pastor, and my wife Robin, who's here this morning, her family has a lot of Riverside connections, and we're very privileged to have a number of Dr. Fosdick's letters where he's talking about different aspects of the people's lives, and letters celebrating baptisms and marriages, and also a few letters that basically say, gee, I haven't seen you in church lately. Where have you been? But New York City was very much at the center of religion in the U.S., I think, and very much at the center of religious publication. If you look at the period around World War II, it was a boom area for a time for people who were writing on different topics. And a lot of Fosdick's books became bestsellers. He emphasized very much kind of what we would maybe call a therapeutic understanding of Christianity, but also tied directly to the kind of politics he espoused in terms of justice and fairness and inclusivity. This is the last plug for one of my books. This one might be a little bit hard to get. I think you could probably get it on Amazon. But Walter Rauschenbusch was another individual with pastoral ties to New York. He had been in the late 19th century a minister at a German immigrant church in Hell's Kitchen. And a lot of his writing became very influential to the civil rights movement. And I have this quote here from Martin Luther King, which I won't read, but it reflects this kind of fundamental idea that King, when he read Rauschenbusch as a seminarian, he was attracted to the way that he felt Rauschenbusch emphasized the whole gospel. That was both very personal as well as social. The highlighted quote here that comes from the end of this particular quote that that Martin Luther King used in his 1958 book, Stride Toward Freedom, has an addendum: a religion that ends with the individual ends. And those are the words of Harry Emerson Fosdick. Now, very briefly, because I want to finish and I'm anxious to hear some of your questions, Fosdick, like Dr. Parks, was very much an actor, probably the principal actor in what became known as the fundamentalist modernist controversy. In the 1920s, there was an effort of several denominations in the US to restrict and essentially enforce a rigid doctrinal orthodoxy. Presbyterian Church, historically very Calvinist, a lot of creeds, a lot of confessions of faith. And the leader of what became known as the Fundamentalist was J. Gresham Machen, who was a professor at Princeton, and he became sort of the symbol of an individual that was trying to lead campaigns in certain denominations, particularly his own Northern Presbyterian Church, to drive the liberals out. One of the key targets of the fundamentalists was Harry Emerson Fosdick. Now, Fosdick was an unapologetic liberal social gospeler. He had been the preaching minister at First Presbyterian Church in Manhattan. Fundamentalists like Machen said, what is a Baptist doing in a Presbyterian pulpit? And a liberal one at that. So they were pushing the Presbyterian Synod in New York to basically say all ministers of our churches need to ascribe to certain traditional standards of doctrine. And in 1922, Fosdick preached a very famous sermon at First Pres, Shall the Fundamentalist Win? And in some ways, when we would read it today, it may not strike us as very radical, but I think it's a kind of sermon, and just a few quotes that I put up here. When you look at it, it is a reflection of just how pertinent it is today in terms of the struggles of churches, the question of who counts, who doesn't, the continued debates over a number of hot-button social issues. I think Fosdick's words are very, very prescient for a lot of the situations we face today. Now, in the short run, Fosdick lost. He regretfully had to leave First Presbyterian Church because he didn't want to ascribe to the Presbyterian standards. But thanks to John Rockefeller, in a few years, Riverside Church opened in 1930. And I think Fosdick witnesses again to the kind of debates that are not just buried in the past, but very much at the forefront of a lot of churches today. Finally, I would just mention that when you look for the seeds of the social gospel today, you see them in the Protestant ecumenical movement, in organizations like the National and World Council of Churches. You see it in the legacy of the Civil Rights Movement. You see it in a number of examples of ecumenical and interfaith cooperation. The gentleman in the lower right, a friend of mine, Paul Rauschenbusch, The great-grandson of Walter Rauschenbusch is the president of an organization called the Interfaith Alliance. And very important, I think, again, to witnessing to an understanding of Christianity that moves beyond sort of the narrowness of what we would see with fundamentalism. The gentleman here, and I think this is someone, Nathan, you would be familiar with at Yale, is a very well-known minister named William Barber, who has been involved for a number of years in an organization called Repairers of the Breach, very influenced by the example of Rauschenbusch and Martin King. And finally, some resources here, different authors. Some of you've heard about my work, but some links to people like Willard and Fosdick. Gary Dorian, a professor at Union Seminary, has written a great deal about this tradition. But again, I'm very grateful to be here, and thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
So Nathan and Professor Evans will have a chance to speak with each other a little bit. And while they do so, I invite you to submit your own questions. We'll have a few minutes for your questions as well. Natalie Johnson, if you're here in the room, has question cards. Just raise your hand and she'll come around to you. If you're joining us online, you can type your questions into the live chat on YouTube, the comments on Facebook, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org.
Thank you so much for this, Dr. Evans. I wonder if you could say a little bit, you talk about this in your book, of sort of the whiteness of the social gospel, particularly in the early years, sort of slow going to come around to issues of racism.
Absolutely.
Could you talk a little bit more about how the social gospel has made its way into non-white spaces?
Absolutely. And this is one of the topics, Gary Dorian, his book, Breaking White Supremacy, Martin Luther King and the Black Social Gospel, touches on that, as I do in the book that you reference. I think part of the whiteness of the social gospel comes from the fact that many of the roots of the social gospel in the urban north were reflected at a time period where many of the white social gospelers were very much focused on economic issues. If you look at the history of African Americans in northern cities like New York, you begin to see an uptick in migrations from the south of blacks coming north in the early 20th century. But there very much was a sense, and this is true of people like Walter Rauschenbusch, they tended to see issues of racial justice. Well, it's a Southern problem. A little bit of that, we don't have those kind of issues in the North. So I do think some, not all white social gospelers, but many were oblivious for a time to the systemic nature of racism that is especially evident when you read someone like W.E.B. Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk. That starts to change, however, in the 1920s, where you begin to see organizations like the Federal Council of Churches beginning to take stands on issues of racial justice, and it becomes much more prominent within sort of the agenda of the social gospel in many churches. I also have to say, however, that when you look at New York, you do see African American church leaders who we would consider to be part of the social gospel. One of the most famous was an African Methodist by the name of Reverend E. Ransom, who was very active in reform work in New York, Boston, and Chicago. But I think as I indicate in my book, and as other scholars have indicated, they kind of were on parallel tracks. And it wasn't really until after World War I where you begin to see, for various reasons, more of a convergence of different themes.
A question about the religious left and why is it not, first of all, its ties to the social gospel, but why is it not stronger today?
That's a great question. I think the religious left, in some ways, I might get in trouble for saying this, but I'll put it out anyway. I think it mirrors the problems of a lot of progressives historically, and we see this in recent history, where the consequence of having a big tent and a consequence of being inclusive, which is a wonderful thing, is you get competing views. You have different understandings on certain social issues. You have differences in terms of tactics. You have differences in terms of priorities. And when you compare politically today, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party has a much narrower swath of issues to work with, that they can use to kind of bring people together. I will be very blunt in saying this, but it's the whiteness that you see within the context of the Christian right or the religious right is not only reflected in terms of skin color, but I think it's also reflective of very narrow ideological commitments. So I think when you look at some of these websites of progressive organizations, you oftentimes, again, are dealing with folk who have very different understandings. They can agree on different principles related maybe to certain ideas and certain statements, what we would maybe call a mission statements, but they have a much more, they have a greater challenge in terms of translating that to action. I think another reason why the left is smaller is when you look at the map of American Christianity, it's very diverse. But I think a lot of religious progressivism, not solely, but heavily leans towards urban areas. It's much more urban than I think it is in terms of more rural areas. And again, I think that highlights to a degree the kind of political divides we see today.
So related to that, we have a question, how does the social gospel inform the current day of division in the country and the response of the church? And I would add to this, particularly as we look at issues of violence and war across the world, what is, the U.S.'s response? Yeah,
that's a great question. And that's one that I really, really wrestle with at a time where I think there is a lot, not only a lot of division, but a lot of anger. And this might be a simplistic answer to the question, Nathan, and I hope it isn't, but I hope one of the things that progressive churches and religious communities are able to do is create spaces of having difficult conversations. And I might get trouble for saying this, but I really am at a point where I think Facebook has become an enemy of sustained reflection. And it generates emotions very well. And I recognize, again, that social media can be an amazing tool for organizing in different ways. But I think part of what I hope churches are able to do in some way, and this is part of an argument that a sociologist at Harvard, Robert Putnam, an economist, made several years ago, that one of his worries about churches, and particularly what we would call mainline denominations, is that historically, one of the things they've done well is they've been bridging institutions. They've allowed people from different perspectives to kind of find a place to meet and create some kind of dialogue. And he worries about the fact that that's disappearing, that people are becoming more prone to want to hang out with people who believe exactly the way they do. If there's 85% agreement, that's not good enough. You have to have sort of an unanimous sense that we're all on the same page. So I guess my hope, Nathan, is that part of the legacy of the social gospel is I think sometimes before you act, you need to find time to reflect and talk. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily forming another committee to do that work, but it does mean, I think, having the opportunity to hear each other in a spirit of love and in a spirit of compassion and in a spirit of openness, to perhaps hear ideas that might be in some ways counter to your own.
Time for one more, maybe.
Okay, so here's this one too. Are there any elements of the social gospel in contemporary evangelicalism?
Yes, that's a great question. I think one of the classic examples of this, some of you might have heard of the name of Jim Wallace, connected with the Sojourner movement. There's a whole legacy of what is oftentimes called progressive evangelicalism. And even though, when you look at it in relationship to what we associate with conservative evangelicalism, it's much smaller. I think it's had a very important role in terms of kind of reaching the public square and being a major player at the table of progressivism. I think historically the one major rift in terms of social issues between progressive, let's say it this way, progressive liberals and progressive evangelicals has been abortion, where the progressive evangelical stance has been very strongly pro-life on that issue. However, unlike other conservatives in that tradition who argue against abortion, progressive evangelicals say, well, if you are pro-life, that means pro-life in everything. You're against the death penalty. And if you are expecting people to have children, the state has to take a responsibility in of their care, which is completely against the kind of cutting of public services that many evangelical conservatives emphasize. So it's a bit of an outlier movement, and I think, again, there is a lot of connection with mainline progressivism that you see, but there are certainly issues and abortion is probably the most major sticking point, I would say.
So we do need to end, but I'll just fit in one more really quick question.
Excellent.
Can you reflect a little on General Conference this past week?
Yeah, so thank you.
What's happened in your own denomination?
Well, the United Methodist Church, and some of you are aware, has engaged in now it just ended. In 1972, the General Conference passed a resolution saying that homosexuality was incompatible with Christian teaching. And that led to a number of other restrictions, particularly against LGBTQ people entering ordained ministry. A lot of complicated politics behind this. The United Methodist Church has been especially strong in the South, where there's a very strong conservative base. There's been a lot of resistance for many years of removing those prohibitions, and I think it's very similar to the challenges in the Episcopal Church and in the Anglican Communion. Methodism is growing, particularly in African countries, where homosexuality is very much seen in many ways as a sinful behavior. And there's been an alliance between U.S. conservatives and international delegates that's blocked the effort of more progressives to change the church's stance. What the United Methodist Church did at this General Conference, which has similarities to the structure of the Anglican Communion, it moved in the direction of regionalization. So there's going to be greater autonomy for Methodist churches overseas, and correspondingly, the American U.S. Methodists are going to have more oversight of positions, social issues like LGBT rights that will be decided by Methodists in the U.S. So it's in some ways it's a decentralization, but it's very much rooted in sort of the idea that different regions of the Methodist Church are able to make decisions based on their own unique circumstances. So that was exciting. Also, the General Conference passed, there's been ongoing dialogue between the United Methodist and Episcopal churches. So, the Methodist passed this agreement of full communion that will be at your General Assembly, I believe, in 2027. So it'll be interesting to watch that.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Christopher Evans and Nathan Peace. Please join me in thanking them.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
And I have confirmed that we do indeed have two of Professor Evans's books. We have both The Social Gospel in American Religion and Do Everything, the Story of Francis Willard in our bookstore. So do pick those up as you leave, and you might be able to catch Professor Evans for a signature if you'd like as well. And we hope you'll be back for the forum next week. It is Mother's Day, and we'll be talking about issues of maternal health with Professor Monique Rainford of Yale. And please join us next door in just a few minutes for worship at 11 a.m.